What does it mean to live a life marked by both faith and fragility, where love endures even in loss and where this human soul finds its shape through story? Today on Lead with Storytelling, I have the immense honor of welcoming Kathleen Norris, acclaimed poet, essayist, and spiritual writer, whose work has been a compass for so many of us, navigating the inner life. You may know Kathleen from the Cloister Walk, Dakota, or Amazing Grace, books that bring monastic rhythms, poetry, and personal reflection into our everyday vocabulary of faith. I still remember reading the Cloister Walk as a young reader. It shaped so much of how I come to see the world through metaphor, stillness, and sacred attention. Kathleen's way of drawing out the soul of a place or a person or a season of life is nothing short of extraordinary. Our writing doesn't just inform, it slows you down, asks you to listen, and reminds you what it means to be human. In this conversation, we talk about her forthcoming book, Rebecca Sue, A Sister's Reflections on Disability, Faith, and Love. It's a deeply intimate portrait of Kathleen's late sister, and through it, a meditation on dignity, grief, kinship, and how those with disabilities reveal the truth about what matters most. We also talk about writing as an act of devotion, the role of memory and metaphor in storytelling, and what Kathleen has learned about love and vulnerability through the sacred walk of care. Whether you are new to her work or you've treasured her words for years, like me, I know you will find something meaningful in this conversation. Let's dive in. Hi, Kathleen.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks so much for joining us. Happy to have you here. I had said earlier that I grew up on your work, and it was an integral part of my formative years as a young reader and a Christian. And I want to say, on behalf of everyone who's read your work, and everyone who is yet to and will read your work, thank you so much for sharing your insights, your thoughts, and your gifts.
Well, thank you. And I like your emphasis on storytelling. And, Christians have a perfect model for storytelling in the figure of Jesus himself, because one of my favorite little turns in scripture, when you're reading along in the Gospels and this lawyer approaches Jesus with the question, what must I do to be saved? And he knows the answer: to love God, to love your neighbor, as yourself. But then he's going to push a little farther, and he said, just who is my neighbor? He's a lawyer. He wants the details, right? So he's probably expecting some kind of a legal definition of a neighbor. And instead, Jesus said, well, a man was walking down a road and he was beset by robbers. You get the story of the Good Samaritan. And I can just see that lawyer going, he's telling a story? I wanted an answer. And that's the gift of stories, that when you read a story, you have to find your own answer in it. It's not just going to be neatly packaged like a legal definition. Stories have such a power that way. And I think, where would I be without storytelling? And the new book's a little different because I'm storytelling mostly about another person. In all of my memoirs, I've always included other voices because I don't want to have it just be about me. But in this book, I'm really focusing on my sister, one of my younger sisters. And that's been interesting to sort of completely focus on another person and try to tell as many of her stories, as I could.
That's beautiful. You've written deeply about place, faith, and the inner life, but Rebecca Sue is especially personal. And I remember you've also written about your husband in Acedia, a monastery, and a marriage and monastery. But what made you decide that now was the time to tell your sister's story?
Well, she was such an interesting person, and she had a big personality, just kind of like my dad. But because she was brain damaged at birth, initially disabled, a lot of people kind of discounted her, didn't take her that seriously. But we grew up with her. I mean, I was 5 years old when she was born. She was always part of the family, and she had this big personality. Said a lot of really funny things, a lot of really great things. And as she got older, she actually acquired some real wisdom about things. her brain damage was considered borderline. So lots of times people would meet her and they might think something was a little off, but they could have a really good conversation with her if they were interested. So I just thought it was time for me to tell her story and tell the family story of what it was like to be with her in the family. And one of the unique things about her is that she was brain damaged by medical mistakes when she was born, but she was intelligent enough to know that that's what happened to her. So she had this burden of real grief and anger her whole life that she had to kind of, and so she had a difficult personality. But I just thought she's just an interesting person, and I want to write about her. I'm not objective because I'm her sister, but I think there's a story to be told here. And I think, well, she once told me, she said, you should write a book. She was very jealous when my book started getting published and they got on the bestseller list and all that stuff. So one time she said, well, you should write a book about me so I can be famous like you. And I thought that was a call. That was a call. This was something at the back of my mind for a long, long time. And this was the time to do it. And I was fortunate enough to find a really good publisher for it. And it's kind of a miracle that it's coming out. It went through some rejection, a lot of kind of in limbo for a while. And I'm just really relieved that it's finally coming out.
And that is true. I remember that part of the book where you described her feelings towards you, and a very honest jealousy, almost like a professional jealousy, because I do recall that you also called her a writer, and there were just these beautiful lines that you shared from her letters and her journal, which especially for me were really tender, were very heartwarming, almost in a very terse style, as you would find in the works of Emily Dickinson. And it broke my heart because knowing that we've all experienced, or we've had someone with such a gift walk on this earth at one point in time, but not have been experienced or known by many more. It's sad. But you describe your sister not only through memories, but also through moments of tenderness and frustration, humor, and grief. What was it like to hold those?
And also, her own words, because she was very articulate in her own way. And of course, she grew up in a very verbal family, so she was challenged even as a kid to keep up with us, because our whole family, our conversations and stuff like that. So in a way, I think. And sometimes she would tell us to slow down. We were going too fast for her. I mean, but she would tell us that. She was very open. But she had a wonderful way of expressing herself. For years, everyone in the family, my mom, my brother, my parents, my brother, and I, we would get these long letters from her in sort of stream of consciousness writing. And that was one of the things I had a lot of this correspondence that I could read and go through. And I picked out a lot of passages that I thought, this really reveals who she is. In a sense, she was a good writer. And I've been haunted for years by the sense that she was really supposed to be I was going to be a librarian. That was my goal when I was in college, maybe to become a librarian. But that Becky was meant to be the writer in the family. And of course, that got thwarted because of her disability. But it was really fun to bring out so many of the really wonderful things that she said, both in person and in writing. And one of the stories that she loved to tell years after it happened, I think I was about 14 and I got my first lipstick. And Becky was very jealous because she was too young to have a lipstick. And again, this is the jealousy thing coming in. With sisters all go through this kind of thing. So I found her one day. We lived in a Navy housing outside of Honolulu that had a cinder block wall. My sister was writing on the wall with my lipstick. And she knew that was bad. I mean, she was, and I was furious, but I knew I couldn't hit her. I'd get into real trouble if I did that. So I think I had some sheet music. I threw some sheet music at her and I yelled, and my mom came in and broke it up. And Becky just looked at me and said, "You can't hit me. I'm retarded." what do you do? You know, that she was aware enough of her situation to take advantage of it. So growing up with her was complicated in a lot of ways like that, and trying to figure out what she was responsible for. Like she knew that what she was doing was bad, and other times where she really couldn't help herself. She wasn't responsible, and you would have to really protect her and stuff. But that you can't hit me, I'm retarded. Well, she found out that really didn't work too well with sisters. I was still really mad, and but just that kind of thing, and these stories, and she loved to tell that story on herself. And years later, when she had cancer treatment, and she lost her hair, and a charity had these wigs at the hospital. You could pick out a nice wig, and Becky always had sort of very dark hair. She picked out a little blonde page boy, and we would go, and she really loved that wig, and we would go to the movies. From taking the ticket, she would look at her and say, "I'm her only blonde sister," just claiming that for herself. I mean, that's what I mean by a big personality. She was out there in the world, and it was really a joy to be able to tell so many stories about her. And there's some really hard stories in the book too, because she did go through a lot of pain in her life. And when she was diagnosed bipolar, that triggered a lot of really bad behavior, self-destructive behavior. And so the whole family had to kind of really try to protect her from herself. So there are stories like that in the book too. But there's so much of that wonderful spirit. I'm her only blonde sister. Right. I just, it was wonderful. She was great company in that sense. Always full of surprises.
Yeah. But she draws in that, so much emotion. She as much as she also exudes. And leads me to this question, which is, how did your faith shape the way you approached this story? I mean, in writing about her disability, you don't sentimentalize. You actually, but you don't exactly shy away from love. So how did your faith shape the way you are?
Well, one of the things in the book, the title of, I have a lot of very brief sections because telling just a story here, a story there. But my father said about her one time, we learn a lot about love from her. And this was true because sometimes she was very hard to love. Other times and other times it was very easy to love her. And I guess the thing for me is that wonderful basis of Judeo-Christian thinking that every person is made in the image of God. And so it's our job to figure out if there's someone who is disabled, limited in some ways, how does that person reflect the image of God? And I think Becky's openness and generosity, her spirit, a really good spirit, her sense of humor, all of those things came to the fore. And I think my family, it's really funny. My family, my brother and his wife are both pastors. My brother is a United Church of Christ pastor. His wife is an Episcopal priest. We have pastors going in our ancestry, going back to the 1460s in England. So there's a lot of tradition of ministry in our family, and faith has been just a really core part of our family, but we don't talk about it much. And I think that's actually pretty common among pastors and their families. They preach on Sunday, they do pastoral work, but they don't talk a whole lot about God or faith. And we were like that, but that was just rock solid. And I think it's one of the things. Faith was one of the reasons I think that none of us would give up on Becky. Even when she was really acting out and doing really bad things, we realized she needed help, and it was our sacred duty, really, to keep helping her, to be with her, to be present sometimes when even when we couldn't help. There's a lot of I recount a lot of visits to the emergency room with my sister in the book, where I was pretty helpless in terms of what was going on medically, but I was there. I had to be there for her. That was a matter of faith for me. So yeah, I think, I mean, and Becky's faith was very, she mainly believed in angels. She didn't talk much about faith either, but I remember a doctor one time, this was not long after my mother died, and I was kind of depressed. I'd been caregiving for my husband for a long time, and he died, and my parents, and then when my mother died, and I told the doctor, I said, well, I'm right back into caregiving again because my sister has been diagnosed with cancer. And so I'm right back into this caregiving thing. This is a wonderful doctor that you could talk about things like that because she knew she was treating a human being and not an illness, right? And I told her about my sister, she said, well, does she have faith? Yeah. And no one had ever asked that of me. Yeah. He was a doctor. I think he was actually Buddhist. In Honolulu, does she have faith? And I said, well, yeah, she definitely believes that angels are protecting her. And I think, I know she believes that when she dies, her cancer was terminal by this point. When she dies, she'll be reunited with our parents and everyone who's ever loved her. And the doctor said, good, that should help. Yeah. And I thought, okay, coming from a very secular doctor, that was a wonderful question and a wonderful idea that so Becky's faith wasn't traditional. She loved going to church with me. And she loved singing hymns. That was a big family tradition, always loving singing hymns. And of course, there's a lot of good theology in hymns. Yeah. So she loved going to church with me. And of course, my dad was a choir director. So we grew up going to church regularly and singing in choirs and all that kind of thing. So faith was always there. It just wasn't overt on the surface, talked about all that much. But it's certainly there. And I tried to convey that in the book, that it was an important part of our lives.
Yeah, I remember especially around that scene with the doctor where you drew on some experiences from our desert fathers and mothers. And we will talk about this too. Yeah, where you talked about, you try to expand on the idea of quiet piety. And
yes, they don't. That's one of the striking things about when you read that wonderful storytelling of the 4th to 6th century Christian monks. They don't talk much about God either, and their attitude was, if you talk too much about religion, you may not be practicing it, and it might lead you to spiritual pride. And there's some wonderful stories about that in the book, where somebody comes to an old monk, a famous Abba in the desert, and they want to talk about spiritual matters. Like an official comes from a big city and he's all wants to talk about spiritual matters, and the old man won't talk to him, and he's confused. But finally, when he says, "Father, help me because my thoughts are troubling me," well, then we can talk. And so, in a way, it's a little bit like that. The practice and the living of religion. And I'm going back the ancient description of Christians as people of the way, that religion is not a philosophy or a theology, certainly not an ideology, it's a way of life. And I'm hoping to convey that kind of in the book, that's how my family sort of regarded religion and faith. Something you live.
Yeah. How did your years in monastic settings, especially as described in the Cloister Walk? I'm really intrigued by that experience with the Benedictines. Help you sit with the mysteries and difficulties you encountered in telling Rebecca's story.
Yeah, that was a whole discovery. When I was younger, I didn't even know monasteries still existed. I thought they were part of the Middle Ages, and I began discovering them in western South Dakota, and I was living in my mom's hometown. There are Benedictines all over the Dakotas and in Minnesota, and men and women, and they come from this ancient tradition, Christian tradition, that dates back to really the very earliest days of the church, 2nd and 3rd century. but they're still living, and they're running schools, they're running hospitals, and sometimes they're just staying in their monasteries and praying for all of us, and they're wonderful people. And that was a big discovery. And my sister, she didn't quite know what to make of all that, but she knew when I told her, well, these are people who pray a lot. She said, well, ask them to pray for me. So she immediately saw their value to her, that these, and I said, I will certainly, and several of them actually met her over the years when she would come to visit, and she was quite impressed with them. But yeah, that was a real turning point in my life, because raised a Protestant, I had no idea about monasticism and the hospitality, where Benedictines they understand hospitality in a deep sense, that when you're hospitable, you're not trying to make people more like you're accepting them as you are. So the fact that I was a Protestant, that didn't matter nearly as much as the fact that I wanted to go to the Liturgy of the Hours with them, pray with them during the day. That they were struck by that. That's much more important than any differences between us. And Becky took great comfort in thinking about these people, and how the fact that they prayed so much, and they were praying for her. She really liked that. She thought that was great. My father, being the son and grandson of Methodist pastors, was a little more skeptical at first, but then when he met them and became friends with them, he loved them. And of course, as a choir director, he loved their singing and Gregorian chant and all that. So yeah, it was a real turning point in my life, something I never would have expected. But I began to meet them when I was like in my late 30s. It really changed my life, because so many of my friends now are people who live in monasteries, and I go to visit them when I can, email and correspond in other ways. And I think probably just the fact that they're so stable in what they do and their practice of religion and living it every day, I think it helped me as a writer to get more stability. And I think it helped me in a way to be more stable in how I could be with my sister and be a caregiver through her ups and downs. And there were just a lot of ups and downs. And one of the things that I'm so grateful for is that I, through a Medicaid clinic that Becky used to go to, I got access to her complete medical records after she died. And that meant reading over all of the emergency room physicians' notes about her, all these things. That was a real eye-opener, because I knew Becky had a lot of physical problems, but I had no idea how severe they were, all of that. And I'm a good person to take to the emergency room if you have to go, because I won't get hysterical. I understand why things take so long, and I'm willing to negotiate with the nurses and doctors and stuff like that. I'm really good at that because I got training from my husband, my parents, and my sister too. And Becky often she would go to the ER when she felt she was getting too manic, or we all noticed she was getting too manic. Maybe she needed to adjust her medication. So with Becky, it was often psychological, but there was almost always a physical cause. I learned that about that. If Becky was going off the rails mentally, that you almost always meant there was a physical thing behind it. And that was incredibly valuable to learn that. So it's kind of, learn by doing this over and over again. And so a lot of those stories are in the books. And Becky, again, her wonderful way with words, she came up with a word, and I use it in this one section. I'm quoting this doctor, all his medical talk, when Becky was manic. And Becky said, yeah, I get manicky. Manicky is a word she invented, but it's perfect for describing her. Manicky. The medical profession needs that word when people are manicky. And, that's the kind of thing that Becky could surprise you so often with insights like that. Because she knew that she was manicky, and she knew she needed help, which was great. And I knew I had to be there in the ER with her to make sure she got it.
I mean, those and the stories are all beautiful. I mean, I'm not going to even pick a word, stability. I think that's for me exemplary of how you have such a gift for metaphor. Drawing meaning from both ordinary and the mystical. When you sit down to write, does metaphor arrive intuitively, or is it something you return to and then revise?
Oh, well, I think it kind of comes organically. I always think that I stumble across metaphors that are there, like in nature, that they're just there, and I happen to see something, and oh, that looks like this. That it was a famous mathematician, I think it was Riemann, who said, I did not invent differential equations. I discovered them in the world where God had placed them. And I feel that way about metaphor, that one day, one of my poems is about observing one day a bee, getting nectar, whatever he was getting, pollen or whatever he was getting from a hollyhock plant. And it looked like an infant's mouth at the breast, quivering like that, like an infant's mouth at the breast. Now, that just came. I discovered that. That's always been there. That image metaphor was out there in the world, and I just happened to see it one day, and I said, well, this is a poem. I have to write a poem about this. So I went home and wrote that little poem. But I think that's how they usually come. There's a startling revelation that you suddenly see something, but I didn't invent it. I discovered it. And I think that's how metaphor works. And we would be lost without metaphor. We always need similes and metaphors both. And of course, metaphors run deeper, but our language depends on them. Our ability to communicate with other people depends on them, because people say, well, what was that? What did that feel like? And you have to say, oh, it felt like this. It's really in some ways the basis of language.
Yeah, something like an anchor. So how has your approach to writing changed over the years? I mean, especially as you've moved through between poetry, memoir, and spiritual reflection.
Well, two things. When I was first starting out, and I think this is pretty common, I would write something and think it was done, and I'd want to share it right away, even send it to a little literary magazine or something. And over the years, I learned to take my time, sit with it, let this poem or this essay or whatever it is, sit for a while, go back to it, because then I can see what needs fixing. And so I will go through that process now. I'm willing to take the time to do that, understanding that I didn't get it right the first time. You hardly ever do with things that matter. You have to work at them. So sometimes a thing will go through like 9 or 10 revisions. And I write for a little weekly e-newsletter on movies called Soul Telegram. And just yesterday, I was going through an essay that I'd probably been through about 5 or 6 times. Oh, this part of the paragraph, this part should move down a little bit. And then just tiny little things to change a phrase. And I'll keep at it until I have to send it in for the deadline. But so that's been a big change. The other thing is huge change. Like a lot of writers, I started out thinking that writing is self-expression. I have to talk about how I feel, my feelings, all that kind of stuff. And now and I think this is part of the Benedictine influence of their emphasis on hospitality. Now I'm much more concerned with what the reader needs to hear rather than what I want to say. Both are important, but the emphasis has shifted, because writing is so much more than self-expression if you will allow it to be. You can fill it up with your ego so much that the reader doesn't have a good way in. The reader really, well, gee, this person's so self-absorbed, they're writing about themselves and their feelings, and their experiences are always self-referential. The reader has no access to that. And I've been very conscious of trying to give the reader a good way to enter a piece of writing. So that's been a major change too. And just not to be frantic anymore when I'm not writing. When I have days when my brain is just not gonna give me a word to do anything. I have ways to cope with that, but I don't panic anymore. I know. Sometimes I think the words are in there percolating and they will come out when they're ready. I have more faith, I guess, in the process than I used to when I was younger.
I think that speaks to how you know exactly when a story is asking to be told, and as opposed to holding it in silence a bit longer. I think. Thanks for that.
Yeah, yeah. And one thing another story about my sister, and I think it comes to that whole thing of ego, because, Benedictines really emphasize humility, and it's fascinating to be with people who have advanced degrees. They're experts in their field, but they're also humble people. And it's a wonderful, that was an education for me. And some of them actually they're extroverts. They have assertive personalities, but deep down, they're humble people. And one of the wonderful things about Becky was that she lacked some of the filters that we usually use, like to disguise things and just the guile. She really didn't have any guile. And so she would come out and say things that were just, okay, this is how most people feel, but Becky's the one who's going to actually say it. And this was one of my favorite experiences with her. Something really important that happened. I forget, there was a story that I wanted to tell her about some good news I'd gotten. So I start to tell her, oh, Becky, I want to tell you something. No, I go first. My story is more important than yours. Just out there. And I knew enough not to laugh. I thought, oh man, but there it was, that she was so innocently self-absorbed. And I think it was partly self-defense because, most of her life she'd been called stupid and slow and retarded. And she had that ego as a self-defense, which worked. But there it was, oh, my story is more important than yours. I said, most people think that way, but they would never say it out loud. Thank you, Becky. I mean, it was just something that I really had to reflect on. And of course, when I wrote the book, that story had to go in the book because it revealed a lot about my sister.
For me, it had weight. That particular story had weight, and reading it, I needed it to really sit with me. I mean, take some time to really ponder, because just like you said, I know you did mention in the book as well that the honesty with which she did speak at times was kind of reminiscent of a child's innocence.
Yeah.
And I mean, and there is so much wisdom in children's innocence.
In some ways, she never outgrew that. I mean, that was just very much a part of her, lacking the sort of social skills that we use to defend ourselves. And it worked as a good defense mechanism for her to have an assertive personality and to because especially in her childhood, I mean, she was always accepted in the family, and she knew she was loved. That was the place where she really was at home with us. But out in the world, she really had a tough time. Because when you're, in special ed, she went to school in the 50s, and people really didn't quite know what to do with special ed students. One of her teachers just had the kids clean the classroom. Right. I mean, stuff like that. And so for her to have good defense mechanisms made perfect sense. And it was interesting because sometimes she'd ask me to come with her to her counselor, her psychologist. And we would talk really openly about some of these things. And it was always a revelation to me. And Becky learned a lot. I mean, she was capable of learning, just nothing to do with numbers. Her ability to do with numbers was gone. You could almost tell that's part of the brain that just was damaged. She didn't get enough oxygen to the brain at that time. And I can sympathize because I have math anxiety myself. Becky's was really extreme. But in other ways, she really was able to learn things about herself, about other people, about how to treat other people. So she did mature, but just very, very slowly. And even as a teenager, I realized that Becky was going to mature much more slowly than myself or my brother or most people. But it gradually over the years, she became more of an adult, but she still always had that little childlike edge of honesty that put us all to shame sometimes. Oh, can't hear you. You're off. Yeah.
Yes, sorry.
Good. Yeah.
Well, but that kind of reminder is always, always appreciated, and it's definitely refreshing. And I wanted to touch on the role of language and perhaps how you also handle it, because I found, especially reading it, besides the um, medical mistakes that were made, as there was a point where it was said that the medications that she took early on were actually was actually amounted to over medication, and it's understandably they had very little understanding of those conditions then. But it got me thinking, especially after reading the whole book and in context, how the church as well, and the church being not just as an institution but as people, how we process or perceive certain mental illness in by labels,
Yeah.
and not fully understanding those illnesses and the ramifications or the implications of misdiagnosis or mislabeling them actually affects or impacts the way that we approach those people, or we treat such people, whether
Well,
as medical
in my,
professionals or as Christians.
yeah, in my experience, a lot of church congregations, and we're talking just specifically church congregations, not the broader church. Church
Exactly.
congregations do a pretty good job of accepting people who are troubled. In fact, one of my friends said, churches attract troubled souls. And they often are very good at dealing with that. And I'm thinking of the congregations that I've been a part of. If you have people who have emotional difficulties, mental, I guess, retardation, or, they're mentally slow and stuff, churches often have a good way of just accommodating them with love, just accepting them as they are, and not, and I think people appreciate that. Becky certainly did. The little church where the Episcopal church where she went with me in Honolulu, she called it a hugging church because people were very happy to hug her there.
Yeah.
And if she went, she liked to go to the adult. Sometimes she would read the book, and sometimes it was too hard for her. But that didn't matter to anybody. She could sit there, and if she wanted to make a comment, they all knew if she wanted to make a comment, she would, and she would be listened to. And we had other people in that church who were more disruptive. Becky wasn't really disruptive, but other people who were disruptive. But people understood. They wanted to make the place a safe place for them to come. The son of one woman I'm thinking of, who everybody just had a lot of empathy. We had a lot of retired teachers in that church, so they had taught people with ADD. They had a lot of sympathy, a lot of understanding. So I think a lot of congregations actually do pretty well at trying to give a home, a safe, a place where people can come and be accepted when they might not be that much accepted out in the world, or they might be labeled, like you say, they're going to be labeled this and that. And of course, the medication, I think, Becky, we all knew at a certain point, Becky was kind of a guinea pig for medications, starting when she was 12 years old. And all these different diagnoses, bipolar was one. You can take pills for being bipolar. You can take pills for panic attacks. You can take pills for just all kinds of different things. And usually very often people end up over-medicated. It's just a reality. And I think my brother and sister and I have talked about this, my other sister, that we think that all the drugs that Becky took from the time she was 12 probably did shorten her life. I mean, she looked older than the rest of us. It had taken a toll. And I wanted to sort of make that clear, the one page where I list the prescriptions that she was on the month that she died. It's a pretty impressive list. And some of those drugs, she actually was pretty well informed about her drugs. She knew what they were for. She knew how important they were for her and all of that. In fact, she went to, they had her give a talk to other patients about medications, because Becky was that's where some of her intelligence did shine through. She could talk intelligently about the medications and what they were for and why she needed them. And I think that one of the reasons that I kept going with this book, it wasn't easy to write, but I thought, people so often just dismiss people who are known to have brain damage as if they have nothing to say or they're not important. And people in wheelchairs too. That was something I first noticed with my husband. If you're with someone in a wheelchair, the doctors will talk to you rather than the person sitting in the chair. And I got very good, and my husband knew Greek, so he knew medical terminology. So I would always say to the doctor, you can ask him that because he'll give a better answer than I can. And you'd see the light go on in their eyes. They knew she needed to be part of the conversation, and people just tend to drop you out of it or just dismiss you. And I think it's one of the reasons that I kept going with this, because I said, Becky was such an interesting person. She had a lot to say for herself. So I'm going to let her say all of this and let people see who this person was. And the kind of concerns that she had, which are really common to everyone, but she had very special concerns too, due to her brain damage. But just to try to give a complete picture, because so often people just are going to be dismissive and not really understand that there's a fully human being in there. So I hope readers will come away with the sense of a real person, an important person, certainly an important person in our family. She's never going to make headlines, but
I hope that through this book she does eventually. Yes.
I hope so. Yeah.
You've written often about acedia or spiritual weariness. What practices or people help you stay grounded and nourished in seasons of loss?
I just taught a course on it at St. John's School of Theology with the Benedictine monastery in Minnesota. I try to teach a class every summer there on different subjects, and this year we had 15 people who wanted to talk about acedia, and 4 of them were Benedictines, and of course they're quite familiar with it. Most people don't know the term because for years it was considered that only monastic people with their very restricted lives would suffer from it. But to me, it's just a part of the human condition. It's the early monks thought that anger, pride, and acedia were the worst of their temptations, the worst bad thoughts that could strike them. And acedia is this curious mix of restlessness and boredom mixed together with sadness, nostalgia, all these things just coming at you all at once. It's a really nasty combination. And it was interesting to hear in my group of 15 people different ways that they had coped with it. Often just going outside for a breath of air. One was a young mother who was very happy to be a mother, but when her second child was born, she experienced a form of postpartum depression that she hadn't experienced the first time. Postpartum depression, but that she recognized as acedia of not caring. And of course, these 2 very young children, she did care about them, needed to care about them because they're helpless children, right? And so, doing some Bible reading, taking a walk, sort of recognizing what's going on in yourself and thinking, well, what can I do about this? How can I resist this nasty temptation that is really troubling me? And thinking about your thoughts is actually one of the 4th century monks writes about that in order to conquer any of the bad thoughts like anger or pride, you think about, well, what is this tempting me to do? Why is it bothering me now? What is the root cause of this? You think about your thoughts. And when I was working on my book Acedia, I discovered that that's also the latest trend in behavioral psychology, is to ask people to think about your thoughts. Well, this monk of Agrius got there in the 4th century. He's using exactly the same language as contemporary psychologists. You think about your thoughts and then you diffuse. That's how you diffuse them. You think, well, what is it tempting me to do? And he said, well, I don't want to do that. And that's half the battle. Acedia is tempting me not to care about my own children. Well, I don't want to do that. That's crazy. I'm going to reject that right now and find a way to sort of slow down and find, get some fresh air, open a window. I think opening a window is a good metaphor in a sense, because any of the bad thoughts will try to close you off and separate you from other people. Acedia is really good at that, disconnecting you from the things you really care about. So opening a window and taking a breath of fresh air is a good way to sort of fight it. But yeah, it's an interesting subject, and there have been several articles that we found when I was working in this class. People have written about how with the internet and all the distractions that are available to us now, acedia, it's the age of acedia. We're really up against it now, and it helps if you know the word about what you're up against. And so I'm glad people are sort of talking about it a little more. Because when I wrote that book called Acedia and Me, was it a marriage, monks, and a writer's life? I realized that there really hadn't been very many books ever written about it. It's an ancient concept, but it over the centuries that word had kind of gotten lost, and people think of it as just laziness or something, but it's much worse than that. It's much bigger than that. So yeah. But I was happy. I had 15 people who wanted to take this week-long class, and they found some really good articles. There was a Korean philosopher who wrote a book called The Burnout Society, and basically he was writing about acedia. And so they found material that I wasn't aware of. I was still using a lot of the ancient material. She was very rarely bored. She was restless sometimes, but she just had such a great spirit that it just feels like a big relief to me to be able to kind of write this book. It's a much more cheerful book than acedia. That was a tough one because it's a nasty subject. It's a nasty emotion that really can wreck lives. And it was a joy to sort of sit down and tell stories about my sister Becky, or Rebecca. She, in her later years, she was approaching 60. She wanted to be called Rebecca, so I would try to do that. But Becky slipped in there quite a bit too.
Well, I think you pulled off the balance.
I hope so. She would remind me. I called her Becky, Rebecca. I'm Rebecca. Okay. And she was so funny. You could count on her in a way. I remember after my mother died and I was one of the family members going to give a eulogy at her funeral. And I stood up, Becky was sitting next to me, and she tugged at my dress and she said, "Don't mess this up." And when I sat back down, I said, "How did I do?" "You were okay." I mean, she was just, you could count on her to be real, in a sense. It was just wonderful.
So what do you have, or what do you hope readers carry with them after sitting with Rebecca's story or Becky's story, especially those who may be wrestling with their own complicated family histories or experiences of caregiving?
Well, I think just to remember that if you label someone disabled, it's much easier to sort of dismiss them and not understand that they are a fully alive, important, interesting person. That they're, and I think if anybody comes away kind of from my book with that knowledge that here, oh my goodness, her sister, she certainly had her brain damage and she certainly had problems, but she's really interesting. She would be someone good to know, that kind of thing. I'm hoping that people come away from that, because my whole family, we knew that from the very beginning. that my parents were advised in the 50s that they should just put her away in an institution. And again, that was the dark ages in terms of understanding mental disabilities and stuff. And my parents, God bless them, they were like this. They consulted me and my brother about this. And we're just thinking, she's part of the family. You can't just put her away someplace. That doesn't make any sense at all. So she was always a fully real person to us, someone that was just belonged with us and was part of our family. And I'm hoping that the readers can kind of take away that understanding of who she really was, and be more careful about labeling. Because brain damage, and like traumatic brain injury, can just do such terrible damage to people. And but to remember that there's still a person in there that you might want to listen to. Sometimes maybe there's a spark. I know someone, a medical doctor, very advanced oncology work. She suffered a traumatic brain injury, and about the only time you could get her to come back to reality was to ask her medical questions, because that was still in there. That she couldn't distinguish between a cell phone and a remote anymore. But if you asked her a question about medical stuff, she was right there. She, that would enliven her again and stuff. So just if you're dealing with somebody, especially someone with brain damage, find out what it is that will get them to reconnect. With my sister, it was a lot of things. She was pretty much all there most of the time. But it's very tricky, and it's not easy, and especially when bipolar stuff comes in and people acting out manic stuff, and it can get very difficult. It's worth doing. That's the thing. If somebody comes away thinking this person was worth something, she would be worth knowing, and if that helps them understand someone in their own life that they're tempted to dismiss, that will be wonderful. I never know what to hope for a book. My hope is that people will read it, because readers, in a sense, complete the book, complete the work, and they give it back to you. They tell you what it meant to them, and often it's something you had no idea you were doing. Like, I didn't even know I was doing that in this book. It's a wonderful gift that readers will bring back. And I have a Facebook page now for Kathleen Norris, and some of the responses I get on there are just wonderful. People I have no idea, I don't know who they are or anything, but they will write a response to something I post on the page, or they'll write a reaction to one of my books, and it's just such a gift when that happens. And I started out as a poet, so you don't expect to have readers at all. So having readers is that in itself is a gift.
Yeah, you remind me of was it not Keats? I think it was Yeats, who thought he would die and no one would ever read his work.
Yeah. And Emily Dickinson. Emily, look what happened to her.
She didn't intend. I don't know what was it again. I know she wasn't published or renowned until she died.
She published a very few poems in the local paper, and she sent some to her friend Higginson, who was a really interesting guy. He was this abolitionist who actually fought for the Union in the Civil War. He was an interesting guy, but she sent some things to him, and she shared her work with a little of her work with Helen Hunt Jackson, who was a very, very well-known poet at the time. And of course, most people don't even know who she was anymore. Dickinson is much more famous. So she did share a little bit of her work with people, but most of it was just tucked away. She would put these folios of poems and stitch them together into little booklets and just put them in a drawer. And that's one way to do it. But it's just she's a gift to the world now.
Oh yeah, she is. She is. Kathleen, thank you so much for your time, and I want to resound again the gratitude that the world owes you for the stories and for the insights that you shared and through your stories.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. God bless.